But how about this Eagles-Cowboys game?
It was like a treat. Being like a wide receiver guy, there were so many great wide receiver moments.
And let's be real here. That play, 3rd and 30 by T.Y. Hilton, Eugene Hilton.
It's so much harder to be a guy like CeeDee Lamb that has to play all 3 positions.
Devonta Smith went absolutely bazonkers as well.
Devonta Smith, it's a shame about the low BMI, man. He really could have been a great player. It's a real shame.
Look at the release.
There's your separation.
Great route.
Stutter and go. Gets by clean.
That is unbelievable.
May be the greatest catch I've ever seen.
But how about this Eagles-Cowboys game? Oh, my God. What a great game. Back and forth it was. And, man, I was so impressed by the performance of Gardner Minshew. Maybe I shouldn't be. He was one of my top sleepers in fantasy last week. And I'll tell you this. He has been so impressive. He needs to get a starting gig somewhere. I mean, this is a guy that over his last 9 games, Matt, and actually I'm not even counting this this Cowboys game, but coming into week 16 had averaged more than 300 passing yards over his previous 9 games, and has had scored 2 or more touchdowns in 9 of his last 11 games, right? So like, this is somebody who can absolutely play. And boy, I tell you what, with that supporting cast surrounding him in Philadelphia, I thought he played his tail off, man.
Yeah, I think he played well. I think the box score is a little bit better than his actual play. I think the accuracy was a little shaky at times. He definitely left some throws on the field, but we're nitpicking, right? I mean,
right.
I definitely think he is in that fringe starter, high quality backup tier in the NFL. Like, I would rather have a guy like him than I'd rather have, like Jameis Winston, Sam Darnold, those guys we were talking about earlier. I think you could get away with Minshew as a starter, at least a bridge guy, and he'll be he'll be a free agent at the end of this year. So he definitely will have an opportunity, I think, to go somewhere else. And I think he showed enough in this game to get into like a training camp competition or something like that. It was like a treat. Being like a wide receiver guy, there were so many great wide receiver moments. I don't know. I don't know where to start. I mean, obviously, because AJ Brown was doing his thing, of course, and the Cowboys were even kind of using Trayvon Diggs to track AJ Brown around the field early on in the game, which is not something that they normally do. But then as soon as I saw them doing that, I was like, oh boy. 6.
Devonta Smith is about to, yeah, exactly. And he sure did.
Nuts. And he did, yeah. And I come away from this game I know I've said this on the pod a couple of times recently, but he's a 1B receiver. He might be the Eagles' number 2 receiver, but he is not a number 2 receiver. Okay, like he just happens to play across a guy who is a fringe top 5, top 7 at bare minimum player at the position in AJ Brown. But yeah, I mean, Devonta Smith, it's a shame about the low BMI, man. He really could have been a great player. It's a real shame.
Oh my goodness. But the thing is, it was a combination of the BMI and he didn't test the speed. God,
well, he's old. He's old. He was in college for so long. I mean, those guys that stay in college for so long are never good.
There were so many like narratives that he broke. Like he broke people's brains.
Just stuffing it down the spreadsheets, every single time here. I mean, he's just a great player, and he's similar with Chris Olave, who had a lot of like the non-early declare type stuff in his profile. Right. A small, not the same. He didn't weigh like a middle schooler or whatever, but he was not the same size speed as a guy like Smith. But it's similar guys that just, hey, if you just watch them play, man, they're great, and especially for Devonta too, man. He is. As a rookie, it was like, this guy's out there winning as an X receiver, despite his size. Like, he's getting open. His reception perception profile was, pretty much flawless. And God, I wish I drafted him in more places because of that profile. Just obviously had some questions about the offense, questions that ended up, not aging well because of how good Jalen Hurts been, but really because of how good the ecosystem is in general. Like, you can drop Gardner Minshew into this offense, and it not that it doesn't skip a beat, right? I think they might win that game if Jalen Hurts is back there, but it still looks, I think so. It still looks really, really good. And I mean, what is the hole in Devonta Smith's game right now? Like, because we know he's a great separator. Yeah, none. I don't think so. I mean, this game in particular, and obviously, again, has the coverage matchup, right? Where we want to attack Dallas with those number 2 receivers, guys not playing on Trayvon Diggs' side, but still, level of competition, whatever, guy was making like unbelievable acrobatic catches. It's very, another guy I think who's not a number 2 receiver is more of a 1B, like very Tyler Lockett-esque in the way he can track deep balls and win in those tight spaces and really make highlight reel catches.
Let me ask you this: player comp. Always a fun game, but is he Marvin Harrison? Is he like a Marvin Harrison 2.0?
Well, yeah. Well, number one, let me just be clear about Marvin Harrison. Wasn't doing reception perception back in Marvin Harrison's prime. Right. I believe I was in high school.
Correct. Yes, I think you were in middle school, right?
Maybe, yeah. I know I drafted Marvin Harrison on my first fantasy team.
There you go. There you go.
I think it was a down year that I drafted him, if I remember correctly. Not a good first or second round pick by me. But regardless, that's not the point. Point here is that, yeah, I think it's actually a very similar player, a lighter guy, whatever. But I think he's on that same axis of player as like Calvin Ridley, Stephon Diggs, like the outside the numbers, big time separators. Very similar player in that regard. But yeah, obviously Harrison's the comparison because he's a smaller guy. And it's a good lesson that you can't call somebody an outlier when they've already like, oh man, if he is a successful NFL player, he's going to have to be an outlier. Well, he's already an outlier of a player at the collegiate level because he's playing at that weight, winning at that weight, and winning the Heisman at that weight.
Right.
Like, we just don't talk about that enough, that like wide receivers don't win the Heisman. Okay. Cause there's like usually a quarterback or running back or something like that. And then this guy just goes out and does what he does. He's so impressive. So he was already an outlier. He's continued to be an outlier at the NFL level. And man, I just think he is such a fun player. And I love when you get two two-man wide receiver duo like this, that the guys really just complement each other in AJ Brown and Devonta Smith. And man, it's just been fun.
Yeah. Devonta Smith, 12 targets, 8 catches, 113 and 2 touchdowns, and was just absolutely dominant out there on the field. And, another player that absolutely went bonkers was a CeeDee Lamb, 11 targets, 10 receptions, 120 and 2 touchdowns. And I thought the most notable thing about what CeeDee Lamb did was that they pretty much, they stuck him inside about 60% of the time. He only lined up out wide 38% of the snaps. And I tell you, almost all of his production came while lined up inside. 9 of his 11 targets came while he was lined up as an inside slot man. 9 of his 10 receptions, 113 yards while lined up inside, and 1 of his touchdowns lined up inside as well. But no, this guy just absolutely dominated from the slot.
Man, I know we talk about CeeDee Lamb a lot on the show. I think he might be one of my most favorite wide receivers in the NFL right now. But man, I got to give Kellen Moore a lot of credit in this game in particular. CeeDee Lamb was already having a good game, and then Avonte Maddox, the Eagles slot corner, gets hurt, and a backup comes in there, and they just, I've been saying people have been where's Waldo on Kelvin Joseph on the Cowboys secondary. They weared Waldo like the slot coverage there for CeeDee Lamb. 38.1% targets per route run against zone coverage in this game for CeeDee Lamb. And he just went, when lined up in the slot, he just went berserk. And it just really shows like the level of wide receiver he has graduated to, I think is among right after those elite wide receivers. I think he's right there in that group because, defense is starting to account for this too. Jory Epstein wrote a great piece for Yahoo recently. I retweeted it this morning. I'd encourage people to go check it out. Like the amount of growth and the amount of work that CD has put into his route running and his understanding of leverage of zone coverage. And it was great timing by Jory to write that piece. And then for him to have that game against the Eagles zone coverage secondary, it was like perfect timing because he really has become that type of player. And he got 26.5% of his yards after the catch in this game. His understanding of leverage and then the way they're scheming him into these slot looks, it's allowing him to actually look a lot like CeeDee Lamb from Oklahoma when he was such a yak merchant there. That's
a very good point, and something I hadn't really thought of. It's such an interesting conversation that surrounds CD, right? Like people want him to be this dominant X receiver. And maybe that conversation is a little dated. Maybe we should want him to be a dominant number 1. And maybe for him to be a dominant number 1, he's got to do what he's doing this year, which is basically splitting up the slot and outside looks. I'm not sure where I fall on that, because again, the history of football is long, and the history of football is, it's pretty telling. But and again, you know me, Matt, I'll be the first one to admit, like, I look for that big old, bodied, speedy X receiver on the outside. And if you want to run your passing game through that feels comfortable to me. But as we have seen recently with Cooper Kupp, you can absolutely destroy defenses with a great wide receiver lined up inside as well.
Yes, you absolutely can. And I think CeeDee is that guy. And to his credit, and this is something I talked to CeeDee Lamb recently about, was it's so much harder to be a guy like CeeDee Lamb that has to play all three positions and that has specialized at all three positions at this point in his career. And I was glad that when I asked him about that, like, hey, talk to me a little bit about playing all these positions. Like, I think it goes undersold, like how difficult that is. He's like, yeah, it is really difficult. Like, I was glad he didn't mince words when I asked him about it. It's like, it's not like, okay, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to be like a 90% slot player. I'm only going to play a slot, or I'm only going to play X. It's like having to play in those different positions situationally is really hard. And I actually think that's it's been nice that they've really made him more of like that 60% slot guy this year, because it allows him to just focus on one thing. And I think that's where you see that understanding of leverage, the zone coverage breaks, like where he can, because there's just these details that he's got on the top of his routes at this point, make him just always open. I can't wait to see what his zone coverage success rate looks like at the end of the year in reception perception, because I think it's going to be pretty high, because he's really he's always in the right spot for Dak. He's always in those great positions. And now we're seeing if the Cowboys can get production from their outside receivers, T.Y. Hilton, I know it was just one catch, but that was impressive for T.Y. to go and rip like a 50-yarder on 3rd and 30. And, Michael Gallup catches a touchdown as well. Like, if they can get some production from those outside receivers, Joy highlighted this in her piece. You never see this happen, but like against the Jaguars, there was a play towards the end of the game where literally, like, because of CeeDee's route, he ended up with like 3 guys near him. Not like all 3 guys are covering him or whatever, but he ends up with 3 players near. And the Jacksonville Jaguars are totally okay to just let, like, the outside receivers just run go routes in single coverage on the outside. But if they can get production out of guys like T.Y. on the outside, which is crazy because he's a billion years old, or Michael Gallup there as well, now you're starting to really cook with something there, and you can have a really special passing game that primarily functions through the slot receiver.
Let's be real here. That play, 3rd and 30 by T.Y. Hilton, Eugene Hilton, coming in off the couch. Like, this dude was on his couch a month ago doing nothing. This dude on 3rd and 30, biggest moment of the game. They don't convert right there. That game is over, dude. Like, the fact that they convert on 3rd and 30 keeps that drive alive, keeps the game alive, and everything that cascaded after that came because they converted on 3rd and 30 with a long-time downfield vet in T.Y. Hilton, man. Special throw, special catch, and boy, I tell you what, that was a special moment in that game. I was so gassed as that game was going on. And man, if you guys watch my DirecTV show, man, like I couldn't get off of that moment. My co-hosts are looking at me like, man, this guy is really on one. But I mean, you just think about all the moving parts that go into that one play.
Yeah.
And boy, I tell you, it was pretty special.
For me too, it's like sometimes you see something like that play out, and it's like, wow, this is what this offense has been missing, because Michael Gallup is a guy, again, we don't expect he's 100% healthy right now. Like, he might not be 100% healthy until beginning of next year, like from a football perspective, or maybe like we're not even close to 12 months, since his ACL tear. It happened in January at the end of the regular season last year.
Right.
So we're not even 12 months out of it yet, but he's a vertical receiver, but he's more of like a vertical downfield receiver. He's not a necessarily a speed guy. I do think Michael Gallup's an underrated route runner, an underrated separator, but he's not a vertical speed guy. Like,
no,
I would have definitely told you that T.Y. Hilton, like, based on his RP profile last year, I think he might have been playing through injury, stuff like that. But I was like, he might have lost that speed. But hey, you know what? Some time away from the game can really help sometimes get the legs back. And, he looked like he still had a little bit of that speed. And that's like what this, for me, when I saw the 50+ yard catch, like, it'd be like if that's what we want from the Chargers, right? We always talk about the Chargers, like, lacking speed. I think Dallas has a little bit of that same thing, even if guys like CeeDee have juice, Michael Gallup have juice. probably more so than the Chargers counterpoints for sure. But like some speed as that third receiver spot, that'd be great. And if Ty can give them that, even if it's just for, I mean, what he played like 11 snaps in this game? Yeah, he played 11 offensive snaps. He only had the one target, but it was a pretty important one. He runs 5 routes in the game. Okay, if you can give him 5 to 10 routes of speed in the game, that's pretty important.
Routes. Dude ran 5 routes. To that point too, like going back to the whole Chargers example, it's like that injury to Jalen Guyton. We
I know,
at the time didn't think that it was going to be that big of a deal, but you know what? It was. Jalen Guyton may not be on the field, 90% of the time, but I tell you what, man, they absolutely, those 5 times that he goes downfield, like they need that. You know what I'm saying? And if T.Y. Hilton can give it to him for the Cowboys, man, like I tell you what, I think you're absolutely onto something. They need that speed, and it's not just speed too, as we saw with Hilton. Like he gives them reliable speed down the field, like a guy that can make grabs in difficult spots, in big spots down the field. That's what they need, and I think that's what they got. Hey, last thing I'll say about CD too, the fact that he is able to kind of like overachieve and like play all 3 different receiver spots, like I almost wonder, like, do you think like the Cowboys themselves did not appreciate how difficult that is and then tried to apply that to a rookie in Jalen Tolbert and kind of messed him up going into 2022? Because remember, that's all the reports were Jalen Tolbert's trying to work inside, outside. They didn't really have a clear plan for where they were going to mix in Jalen Tolbert. Now, I wonder if that just screwed him up.
Yeah, because there were times this offseason, I was like, God, I forgot Jalen Tolbert exists. But there were times this offseason where it's like, oh, Tolbert is making plays in training camp, but it feels like the longer the offseason went, the more he fell behind. And yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe that's a part of it, because it is really hard. People don't understand like how I always say this all the time. It's like basically playing 2 different positions. Like what a guy's doing at X receiver is so different than what a guy's doing at slot receiver. Like it's a whole different set of routes, it's a whole different understanding of timing. And then for a guy like CD to do, that's why I think he was a guy who, fantasy managers and especially people in the dynasty community are like, oh, he's not producing what we expected. He's not a real number 1 receiver. It's like, God, he's like 3 receivers. He's like 3 receivers in one, number 1 receiver. He's like basically playing 3 positions, and that is so hard. And of course, like I always thought it was annoying that it's like CD is a guy you drafted in 17th overall, and he was like an incredible prospect that fell to you. Like I stop making his position like changing his role based on whether Amari Cooper or Michael Gallup are hurt. Like just give him a position and let him master it. I think they've finally done it this year, and these are guys 5th in the NFL in targets, top 10 in yards, and he's putting up to these dominant performances of late, which is great to see.